Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us again today for another installment of the Capstone Project, where we interview senior researchers in the field of agriculture. Today we have a special guest that's visiting with us, Dr. Jeffrey Silvertooth, who's been teaching with the university for over 36 years. And he's currently working as an extension specialist focusing on agronomy and soil science. Today he's going to share with us some information about irrigation, technology, and some of the formulas used to calculate how much water we should be putting on the field. Welcome.
Robert, thank you. It's nice to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to join you and participate in this project. In relation to our introduction and discussion, as you indicated before, I've been at the University of Arizona for over 36 years. And I came in as an extension specialist, an agronomist, soil scientist, 36, almost 37 years ago, and worked in that capacity full time for 15 years. And I was a department head for 12 years. Then I was the Associate Dean and Director for Cooperative Extension for 10, and now I'm back out in the field, literally and figuratively, working again, as you indicated, as an extension specialist again, as I began. And I'm back in the field as an agronomist, soil scientist. And along the way, I've taught classes and been involved in undergraduate and graduate education as well.
Well, thank you for joining us and sharing your experiences with this subject matter.
My pleasure to do so. You know, what also contributes to this is my background is in soil science and agronomy, and having graduated from Kansas State University in 1976, I then worked for 5 years in the field as an agronomist crop consultant out in western Kansas, the High Plains, went back to graduate school. And then, of course, I came to the University of Arizona in 1987, and I've been here ever since.
So, maybe we can start off by talking about some of Arizona's agriculture and
right.
and where they're needing this water.
Right. Well, Arizona agriculture is unique. It's a desert agricultural ecosystem, and what we have basically is about 1 million acres in production, most of it in the southern part of the state, in the alluvial valleys below the Mogollon Rim, and mostly in the Sonoran Desert. One of the things about Arizona that's unique is the elevation, the ranges of elevation that we have. We're sitting here in Yuma today at about 150 feet above sea level. Just about 60 miles south of us is the Sea of Cortez. And then when you go straight east of us across the state horizontally to the east, to the eastern border around New Mexico, we're at about 4,500 feet, 5,000 feet in the valleys where agricultural crop production takes place. That span of distance along the southern border, southern range of Arizona primarily consists of most of our crop production acreage. And of course then it extends up the Colorado River Valley north of here on the Arizona side of the river into the Parker Valley and Mojave Valleys. But collectively speaking, we're conducting crop production agriculture, utilizing this water. Water is essential for the entire crop everywhere you go in the state. And we're doing this from a range of 150 to about 4,500, 5,000 feet elevation. So it also dictates then the range and the diversity of cropping systems that we have across that elevation span.
And so it must be important for us to get the maximum growth from every drop that we use.
Without irrigation, we're basically in a non-productive position, and we're non-competitive in terms of production agriculture. Water is the lifeblood of the desert, no doubt about it. It's essential for everything that we do. In most terrestrial ecosystems around the world, sunlight's the most limiting factor, followed by water and then bioavailable nitrogen. We have an abundance of sunlight, there's no problem with that. So water becomes our first limiting factor, followed by bioavailable nitrogen, then that's built on the foundation of the genetics that we're using, the varieties that we have in the field. But this water is essential, there's no substitute for it. You can't make up for it with an amendment or any kind of an additive, and it's essential for everything we do physiologically, and is also with regard to the soil management as well.
So historically, has there been a lot of water in Arizona? I mean, it seems like a very dry desert place and a strange place for agriculture.
It is. Well, it's unique in that respect. And actually what's interesting to note is that we use Arizona is responsible for allocations of about 75, almost 80%. About 70, we usually say 70 to 75% of the water in the entire state, fresh water in the entire state. Now, you compare that with the rest of the United States, which is about 38, 40% of water going to agriculture across the country. It seems abnormally high. But globally speaking, across the planet, totally speaking, 70% of the water across the planet is directed to agriculture, consistent with Arizona. And that's because most of that takes place in the arid and semi-arid regions of the world, where 65% of the grain production takes place, over 50% of the crop production takes place, and almost 50% of the population resides. So in the context of the rest of the world, we're more on line with the rest of the world with regard to water diversions to agriculture. And on top of that, we're probably the most efficient overall. There's a few pockets in the world in desert agriculture that do a really good job, but collectively speaking, in the desert regions of the desert Southwest, from West Texas to the southeastern deserts of California, including Arizona, we're actually pretty efficient with regard to the way we use that water. But we always have the incentive to become more efficient every day, and that every drop of water counts. We've actually improved on that a lot in the time that I've been in this region.
So, drilling down into that water interaction with soil, what happens? What is soil like? I mean, if you zoomed in close with the the microscope, what does it look like on the inside, and what does it look like when water hits it? The physical structures, the properties.
That's a great question. A lot of people think in Arizona and the desert Southwest that when you look at our soils, it must just be rock and sand. We have plenty of rock and sand in the desert, that's for sure. But these alluvial soils out here in the Southwest are incredible with regard to a lot of them are fine textured. We have textural classes of soil particles of sand, silt, and clay. The clay being very small, what we call less than 2 microns or 0.002 millimeters in diameter. And it's extremely reactive. Like where we are right now in Yuma, in the Yuma Valley, these are part of these alluvial soils associated with the Colorado River. And these soils have been deposited over like eons of time from the depositions of the flow of the river. And they're tremendous resources physically and chemically. If we can reclaim them from the natural salinity that they accumulate from being in the desert, they're extremely productive. They're young geologically, they're high in fertility, and they're very productive. With the water is the key with how we manage these soils. So you go then to this internal component that you describe, and in terms of what are the physical capacities of these soils, their structure is very conducive to agricultural production because of that structure they have with alluvial nature, finer texture sediments as opposed to the coarser textures like sand and gravel. There's plenty of sand and gravel around, but we have these fine texture soils that have high fertility capacity, high water retention capacity, and they vary quite a lot from field to field, and that's part of the alluvial nature, is the variability that we deal with. But they have unique characteristics that are very conducive to agriculture. Drainage is very important, so these soils and their structure and their physical structure is important, not just to take the water, hold that water, but also to breathe, literally, to be able to have gas exchange, because when a soil is full, actually a lot of water will drain away, and then the water that's left is being held by these physical forces, more or less like we sometimes use the sponge analogy. They say what soil does is to hold the sponge. If you hold that sponge and you saturate it and then you hang it a little bit, the water will drain away. Some water will drain away, but you then still squeeze that sponge. There's a lot of water in it. Yeah. The soil is an analogous kind of system in a lot of ways. A lot of water, we want that extra gravitational water, we say, to drain away. And be able to drain away, and then we want to be able to utilize all that water in the soil for the plant production purposes. But that drainage is important. It's important to move that water out of that profile for leaching and movement of salts, and also for aeration, so the plants and the plant roots can breathe in that soil system, and the microbes as well.
So when we're looking at the water status of how much water is in the soil, right? If you add just a few drops, there's hardly any in it. But if you totally saturate it, then you kind of fill up those little spaces in between the sponge, right? Those little pore spaces. Right. And can you kind of elaborate on that? What do we call that when it's full or half empty or? Right.
So let's go back and say we take a soil that we irrigate or we apply water to, or a heavy rainfall event takes place, and it fully saturates. The first thing we have is a full saturation. I mean, all the pores are completely filled with water. And then we have a point where the soils cannot hold all that water, so it naturally drains away, as previously mentioned. There comes a point where the soil is holding all that it can, that sponge type attraction, the physical forces, we call them adhesion and cohesion. Adhesion to the actual soil particles, the soil particles particles have electronic charges on their surfaces. They hold some of those water molecules, and the water molecules join together, so to speak, through cohesion, and we're kind of holding hands, so to speak. And there's a certain point with which those forces on the soil particles no longer retain that water, and it drains away. So it leaves some parts of the soil pores open with airspace, and we call that field capacity. That's with all the water that soil can hold. And then as it begins to decline from plant use or evaporation, either way, that starts to dry, it hits a point with regard to plant use and plant production we call permanent wilting point. Now there's physical definitions for permanent wilting point, but those physical definitions for permanent wilting point are classical definitions. I think we say minus 1,500 kilopascals for negative pressure or a deficit like a vacuum, more or less, in the soil, which that holds field capacity. But really, field capacity is going to be unique to that soil. But when we hit a permanent wilting point, permanent wilting point would be minus 1,500 kilopascals. That's by definition. Every plant species has its own wilting point. So there's some plants that don't have a strong capacity to pull that water out of the soil. They're going to wilt a lot longer before 1,500 kilopascals.
So what's field capacity in kilopascals? Field
capacity by definition is usually about minus 33 kilopascals. But that's going to be, physically, if we think about it, that's that point where that sponge, as an analogy again, is holding its full volume of water after that gravitational water is drained away. That's the soil, that's the water that soil will hold. So a lot of people will try to actually sometimes hold that water in like a potting soil, keep it from draining away, but that's not good. You actually want that water to drain out of that bottom of that pot. We want that to happen in our soil profiles as well.
And so the lower the kilopascal number, the drier the soil.
That's right. The more negative the number, it's like the suction, the vacuum is a good way some people would describe that. The attraction that soil has. It's held very strongly. And so it takes more energy to pull that water off of the soil. And some plants just don't have the capacity to compete with those forces on the soil. We're sitting here in Yuma, like in the winter we have these vegetable crops. They're a little weaker in that sense. We have to irrigate a soil that's a little higher in water content for crops like that because they don't have the capacity to compete with the soil particles to pull that water off. You take some of the crops that are in the field right now, cotton, melons, alfalfa, Sudan grass, they're better at pulling that water off the soil profile, off the soil structure. And so all plants vary. So that permanent wilting point is going to vary based on plants and the plant condition.
And so the soil texture must play a big part in that too.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have more coarser texture soils like sands. They're going to have larger pore spaces, but they have less water holding capacity. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive. You might ask a person with the same volume of soil in a vessel of sand versus a clay, which has the more pore space. The intuitive thing would sometimes be to think the sand, because we can see those larger pores. They're macropores, you can see them. The truth is the micropores in the clay add up to a lot more pore space. It means huge in comparison, physically speaking. So those soils will hold a lot more water than a sand. Sands drain better, naturally, but the sands have very low water holding capacity. We usually say, from production purposes, we have about 1 to 2 inches of plant available water, ranging from a sand to a clay type soil or silty loam type soil. So that's quite a difference when it comes down to managing plant available water that way.
And what are some ways that you can assess the current water level status of your soil?
There's a lot of methods to do it. You know, if you're in the field, probably the best method, and I'm kind of, I guess, some folks would classify this as an old school method, but it's the field method. It's actually taking a soil sample, learning to calibrate your hand and calibrate your field to the texture of the soil and the moisture content in that soil in relation to that range that we're describing, from field capacity down to the point where these plants will begin to wilt or need replenishment of that water for irrigation. That's kind of the artistic component, but I still advocate for people to do that. If we were going out into the field for research, there's 2 standard methods that we're always going to go for. A gravimetric approach, where we take a soil sample, weigh it right after sampling, then dry it to complete dryness, drive all the water out of that soil, and then we have completely dry soil. That difference in weight is the that was water, and we call that gravimetric water content. And what we're really interested in, you mentioned those soil pores, we were talking about the soil pores, we're interested in what's the volume of the soil that actually is filled, those soil pores that are actually filled with water. So we can translate gravimetric water content to volumetric water content by just multiplying the bulk density, and that is the weight of the soil per unit area. We usually describe that as grams per cubic centimeter. So if we know the density of the soil, and we can multiply that by the gravimetric water content, we can translate that to volumetric. Most of us soil scientists and agronomists were used to communicating in terms of volumetric water content. That's kind of like the gold standard of water content. There's other methods that people will use, tensiometers, to measure the water tension, that strength again, that the water is being held by the soil particles. That's a good one, but tensiometers are a tool that has their own personality. But if you ask me the gold standard, it'd be gravimetric or volumetric water content. We've oftentimes used for research purposes neutron probes. And neutron probes are calibrated on gravimetric and volumetric water content, but they're very good for measuring water content, but they're laborious to put in. They're expensive. You have to be very careful with using neutron emission with regard to radiation safety. But they're a very good method for us to measure water content on a volumetric basis once they've been properly calibrated. Another interesting point too, I might say too, when we're talking about these variations in soil type and soil texture, a soil probe would have to, like that, a neutron probe would have to be calibrated for each soil type that you're dealing with, more or less site specific. So a calibration curve that I might have on a soil for central Arizona on a Casa Grande sandy loam, and then I come down here to Yuma in the Yuma Valley and I'm dealing with Gadsden silty clay, I'd have to recalibrate that probe to do that. It's laborious, so it's more or less a good research tool. It's not a real practical tool to have in the field.
So you mentioned water draining out the bottom. Is there any water leaving up through the top, maybe through evaporation, or?
That's the main way we lose water out of soils, actually, is through evaporation. That's literally the evaporative demand from the atmosphere. And of course, in a dry climate like in the desert, there's a strong evaporative demand. That's really the demand that we have on our water out of the systems. Plants serve as a conduit, serving as a buffer between the soil and the environment. But the driving force is in the environment. So we call that's the driving force of just that straight water out of the soil is evaporation. But when it goes through the plant releases it, takes it up through the root system, moves through the conductive tissue of the plant, and then it moves out of the stomates, the openings in the leaves of the plant. So the plant literally is breathing. It's letting it's moving that water through its transpirational system, and it transpires. It evaporates on the surface. The plant does that for several reasons. One of the main reasons, and that's how we grow plants in the desert, is they cool themselves on the surface of the leaf, but they also need that water just as we do for metabolic purposes. But that water transpires off that leaf surfaces. Collectively, we then refer to all that water loss as evapotranspiration, the combination of evaporation and transpiration together. And that really is what we describe as what is crop water use. And each plant species has their own personality with regard, their own needs with regard to how much water and how they transpire, how well they can transpire and cool themselves. As a good example of that, cool season plants don't do very well in the hot desert in the summer because they just can't cool themselves very well. The plants that we grow in the summer, alfalfa, cotton, sorghum, melons, for example, right down here, they do a better job of cooling themselves, and those leaves will have a temperature usually not exceeding about 90 degrees Fahrenheit if they're well watered and they're transpiring collectively. But collectively speaking, that water is moving out of the soil regularly through evapotranspiration, and that's what we have to replenish within irrigation.
Can we calculate that, how much water we're losing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have the best way to do that is first make an assessment on this evaporative demand. That was from evapotranspiration, from a reference evapotranspiration measurement. That's done with weather stations, whether they're properly situated, structured, calibrated. We have the benefit in Arizona of an Arizona meteorological network, with about 28, 30 of these weather stations across most of this area in southern Arizona, principally, that I was describing earlier in these alluvial crop production regions. That was established by Dr. Paul Brown about the same time I came here, about almost 40 years ago. And we have now a historical database with this weather system, and we have real-time hourly weather data that comes in from all these weather stations around the state. So if you and I needed to make an estimate on what water use was taking place in a given point in the state right now on a given day, we could have those reference evapotranspiration values readily available to us. And the good part about this too is it's good quality data. They maintain they being Paul Brown and his colleagues, now run by Dr. Jeremy Weiss, they run an excellent network with regard to the very good quality data. So the integrity of the network is good. So if you and I can make reference to those reference evapotranspiration values, then if we know the crop coefficient that's unique for the crop that we're dealing with, the plant species, and that stage of growth, which we can actually find those, they're tabulated. We have several sources of those, one being FAO 56. It's a publication from the Food and Agricultural Organization out of Rome, and those coefficients work pretty well. We also have what's been the kind of like the Bible source for us here in Arizona for quite a few years, a document published by Leonard Erie and his associates from the USDA about desert consumptive use of water, and these crop coefficients can be tabulated or can be drawn from those tabulations. But if we have that tabulation for a crop coefficient, we multiply that by a reference evapotranspiration value, that gives us a direct measurement then for the consumptive use of that crop for that day. So after an irrigation, we can begin to sum those up, and it gives us an estimate then as how much water do we need to apply for the next irrigation based on what's been drawn out of the soil, based on that evapotranspiration response. So it sounds like a convoluted process, but really it's pretty straightforward. We know if we understand the water holding capacity of the soil, and we know that there's going to be a draw through that plant and off that soil surface through this evapotranspiration, we can measure that. So where we're looking at, it's like a checkbook. How much have we drawn out of our checkbook? How much do we need to replenish to maintain that proper balance, which we would want to bring it back to what those original points were: field capacity, that full capacity of our soil, that physical sponge to hold that water, refill it again, and then begin to draw down through evapotranspiration from that crop.
And is that something we calculate once at the season, or do we have to keep looking at that every week as the weather's changed and
Right.
we get a new report?
Right. Good question. You know, there's a lot of discussion today about us using water in agriculture. You know, we get criticized because agriculture uses 70% of the water in the state, 80% of the water in the Colorado River. Well, we do calculate that. We do track that. We have to track that every day. What's the loss of water out of this soil from this cropping system every day? Because that's what we need to know when we come back in and we irrigate. A lot of fields might need to be irrigated on 10-day intervals, for example, depending on the crop and depending on the conditions in the environment. But we don't just irrigate just based on a calendar like we have a birthday. We need to irrigate based on soil water depletion, so that we need to track that. Now, you can track it through the methods that we're describing with ET, or you can go to the field and actually measure that water in the soil and say and understand where your critical point is to trigger the decision for the next irrigation. You also have to be able to anticipate. And if we wait till the day that it's required, by the time we get the water in there, the crop's going to be stressed and will suffer. So you have to be able to anticipate. That gets to be the art. There's a lot of science in this crop production business, but there's an art. So I always say crop production is an art and a science. Yeah. And the farmers that are good at it are very good at they're artistes, and they're very good at making those anticipations, reading the plant, understanding the soils they're dealing with, and making these decisions. But the technology and the science is all right there as a foundation of it. It can be done both ways.
And then how do you know how much water to put on the crop after you've calculated its need? Right.
Let's just go back and say, technically speaking, we'd look at that collective ET, the collective evapotranspiration for the crop consumptive use, since the time it was last irrigated. How much water has been utilized, and that we measure that and say inches of water. So then we could come back and say, how many inches of water do I need to apply to this field to replenish the soil profile, to bring it back up to field capacity, based on how much extractions take place. So it's more or less like saying, how much of my checkbook been drawn down? I want to bring it back to my target level to fill it up after payday. How much do I need to bring it up to maintain my use rate? And so that we can measure that in terms of our inches of water. That's why we often describe too water holding capacity in terms of inches of water holding capacity per foot of soil, for that very reason. So we can make a measurement then of how many inches of water do we need to apply. That's exactly right.
And I've heard it often referred to as the irrigator's equation.
Right. It's an old equation, and it basically describes what we need to do. It's described as a function of like the flow rate. It was just a Q. It's called QT equals dA. You know, the Q is the flow rate of the water. We usually describe that in terms of cubic feet per second. We see CFS of water flow. Most of the time, we know, like coming down the ditch, what our flow rate is. The T then stands for the time that we need to apply the irrigation. The other side of the equation is the dA. That's the depth of water we need to apply. It goes back to that inches of water we need to apply per irrigation times the A, which is be the area. So if you and I are irrigating, we usually know the area of the field we're dealing with, the flow of water that's coming down the ditch, so we know Q and we know A. Then if we're tracking water use, we know what we need to put back in the field to replenish our soil water profile, say to a depth of like 2 to 4 feet. We can easily add that up by checking the soil, make an estimate on our water holding capacity by check, or use one of these other methods, the evapotransit, the weather-based method of measurement, or another tool such as one of these probes or a tensiometer or something like that to make an estimate of the depth of depletion, the depth of water depletion in that soil. So it's that D that we're solving for. Then the next question comes in is the amount of time. The interesting point is a lot of folks think that we can't be efficient with flood irrigation systems very well, but we can. If they're dead level basins, a good level control in the field, have a high flow turnout, that Q rate again is sufficient, and we can go through that irrigator's equation we just described and come back and estimate a period of time. How much time do I need to reach this depth of water in inches that I need to apply to this field to replenish my soil profile? But we have to be disciplined because a lot of times we put that water into the field, and when that cutoff time comes, that T value, where that field isn't covered yet, but by the time we cut the water off, that head of water will move across the field sufficiently for the area that we're covered if we've done this correctly, and we can actually cover that field very efficiently. A lot of fields in this area have water irrigation efficiencies of over 90% because they're managed that way, and they're flood irrigated fields. So it's a little bit of an anomaly with what a lot of people in the general public would tend to think. But yeah, we can do that very well by measuring the water that's been depleted and then going through that irrigator's equation and getting that done. A lot of these farmers, you come back to the art again, and they have a feel for how much depth they need to, how many depth of water they need to apply to replenish that soil profile. They'll know for that field about how much time they need to have, but you can go back and check mathematically very easily with this irrigator's equation. It's an old tool, fundamentals, and it works.
It sounds great. It sounds like a great way to incorporate that mathematical formulas into your daily practices. Can you recommend any other really good irrigation practices that you've seen?
I tell you, there's an old saying that a farmer said to me one time, probably the most important thing we put on our fields is our shadow. And one of the things that I would always say, and the best irrigators, the best farmers, the best managers at this are those who watch their fields regularly. They know the soil types they have. They have a good feel and understanding of that. They understand the science behind it, but they're watching and they're taking care of this system. It's like medicine. It's like being a physician to a large extent. Is you understand the medical science that's going on in the field, but you need to look at the patient. How's the patient doing? How's this patient responding? And you need to look for particular cues. Those folks do that. That's probably the best technique, but that's the art and science component. You go back to other methodologies. I like some of these tensiometers, some of these methods that are used in the field, but you really, at the end of the day, you can't come back, you can't escape the fact that you need someone who can manage out there. We're not going to, there's a lot of folks that would advocate in the course of my career that we're going to get to where we can manage crops off of a computer. When I first came here almost 40 years ago, I was involved in some programs that were being developed with Fortran programming and artificial intelligence at that time to try to develop a capacity to manage basically from the desktop, manage farm fields. They can't do it. They failed every time. But what they do for us, Robert, is they give us some tools to help us kind of refine our techniques. But you can't displace the manager in the field. It's no more you can have me a book about conducting heart surgery, but I can guarantee you don't want me performing it because I don't have the skill set to do that. It's the same thing with these farmers. You can read a lot of stuff in a book and pull the technology out in the science, but you still have to have someone out there that can apply it and apply it effectively. It's one of the resources we have. We talked about water resources, soil resources we have in this state, but one of the most valuable resources we have in this state, this region, is the expertise on the part of the farmers and the people, the consultants, the PCAs, the agronomists, the farmers, farm managers, the people that are in the field making this happen. That's really an irreplaceable resource that we have as well. Same as in medicine.
Yeah. What do you think are some next steps in irrigation technology and practices? What's on the horizon?
Right. Good question. Every drop counts. Like just take the Colorado River. It's a great example. You have 40 million people. depending on this water. 7 states in the United States, 2 states in Mexico, 30 Indian tribes, 6 million acres of cropland, and we use every drop of this water, have since the time I came here. You can drive down just a little bit south of where we're sitting today, and below Presa Morelos, the Morelos Dam, just west of Yuma on the Colorado River, that diverts the last portion of water off the river into Mexico based on the treaty. And we can go down the river just a few miles and cross the bridge at San Luis between the state of Sonora and Baja California, and that Colorado riverbed is dry. The mighty Colorado River is dry. Now, the consequences from that are not too extreme because we're just 60 miles from the sea, but the estuaries and the ecological impacts below that are extreme, and a lot of ecologists and people that were interested in natural habitats are very concerned about that. But the fact of the matter is there's not any more water. And so we have to use every drop we can. There's increasing demand for it, and we see our climate becoming hotter, warmer, and drier. We have to respond to that as well. There's been a reduced flow on the Colorado River. So things that I see coming up for us is, like, all of us in the desert need to first of all recognize we need food, we need water, and we're living in a desert, and it's a finite resource. So being sharply aware of that in terms of what we do for expansion and controlling or managing expansion appropriately with regard to population and agriculture, but also to them maintaining the lands that we have in the future, I think are becoming more critically important, particularly as you have a population like ours in Arizona that's 90% urban. California is 95% urban. Someone has to produce the food and fiber out of these systems, and we're able to do that in the Southwest. In the future, if we had to, Arizona in this desert Southwest has the capacity to be self-sustaining, really. We can grow the plethora of crops and crop types that could actually support this state and this region if we had to. And I think we need to be able to think about that for the future with regard to what a lot of people talk about sustainability for in the future. Environmental sustainability is not only for ourselves, but for future generations, our children, grandchildren, and those unborn generations yet to come. So using all the various technologies that are available are going to be important for us to consider. But the bottom line is we have to be, and we always have in my entire time working out here, I've seen this constant progression. There's a constant interest and desire to become more efficient with our water. By efficiency, there's really 3 ways of looking at that. Agronomic, what do we do with the crop, like we've been discussing? There's economic efficiency. Every farmer has to think about that because they have to stay in business and they have to make a profit. That's the reality. And then there's the environmental efficiency. We can't address all 3 simultaneously, but it takes management. So in looking ahead, I think there's just increasing pressure on our management to get better at everything we do. It's like a lot of other things in our life. Automobiles are getting better, and our technology and our use of technology and our use of the skill sets necessary to manage our cropping systems are the same way for the future.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Silvertooth.
My pleasure. Appreciate the chance to visit with you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and helping us better manage this really limited and essential resource.
It's important for us all. We're all in this together, and I appreciate the chance to discuss that with you today. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today for another session of the Capstone Project. Have a great day.
Thank you.